Hi, you are listening to the Conflict and Development in Africa podcast. This podcast is for policymakers, governments, researchers, students, businesses, and anyone that is interested in conflict and development issues in Africa. On this podcast, we hear from experts from across Africa and the world. Your host, Dr. Michael Nwankpa, will ask the questions you would want answers to. Michael Nwankpa has an extensive experience spanning over a decade studying, researching, writing, and consulting on conflict and development issues in Africa.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Conflict and Development in Africa podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Michael Nwankpa. Today we're going to be looking at elite politics and oligarchic power in South Africa. I'm joined by a very special guest, Dr. Mesrob Vartavarian. Mesrob is a co-lecturer at the University of California, San Diego. He researches and writes on colonial violence and power elites in post-colonial states, focusing on states in Asia-Pacific and Sub-Saharan Africa. Mesrob, I'm very pleased to have you join me today, and I look forward to a very wonderful conversation.
Glad to be with you, Michael.
Brilliant. So let's start off. South Africa is like the whole continent in Africa, with the history of colonialism and all that. But it seems, it seems South Africa has its own peculiar history as well on top of that. So when we talk about these oligarchs, which I think cuts across African countries, elite politics, but if you focus zoning on South Africa for now, who are these elites? What is the configuration? Let's start. What is the configuration? And when I mean configuration, I mean at different levels, maybe ethnicity, maybe of these elites or oligarchs in South Africa. Who are they?
Yes. Well, I mean, South Africa has maybe become more like the rest of Africa recently, but it does have a more particular history in the sense that the oligarchs in South Africa, traditionally speaking, historically speaking, have emerged not necessarily within the South African state. So, okay. And that is one key distinction. Secondly, on a national level, at least, I leave aside the pre-unification era in Southern African history, say prior to 1870 or so, where you had local or regionalized minorities that were elites that were dominating wealth and power. When South Africa begins the process of unification, which lasts from about 1870 to 1910, you have a nationalization of power, a nationalization of the economy, and as a consequence, a nationalization of the elite. As that elite is nationalizing, it is becoming oligarchic in that sense. And that elite is very white. It is indeed white. By and large, mining capital, centered on mining capital, more or less English-speaking, with a sort of just disproportionate sort of assimilated Jewish element to it, but also English-speaking British, like Cecil Rhodes, J.B. Robinson, people like this, who dominate the mineral economy, but interestingly enough, do not end up governing the national state in 1910. So there's already a disjuncture which is occurring at an early period in the national history of South Africa, whereby the political elite and the economic elite are not the same thing. The political elite are Afrikaner, and the economic elites are English-speaking whites or British, basically British whites, who dominate the economy and engineer or support policies within the political realm that secure their wealth and secure their power. So they're basically, in the classic definition by Jeffrey Winters at Northwestern University, a political scientist in the United States, oligarchs use wealth to defend wealth. All right, and that's exactly what the landlords, as they're called in the in the popular terminology are doing. The people who run the gold mines by this point in time, but also coal is coming up in the early 20th century. And much, much later, towards the end of the 20th century, PGM, platinum group metals, are also being developed very heavily. Interestingly enough, however, you often find it's the same conglomerates that go into these different mineral sectors. Gold, platinum, Anglo-American being the classic example, becoming a massive, massive conglomerate and pretty much dominating the South African economy, even though they don't serve as the face of the apartheid state. They're very much in the background, making sure their profits are guaranteed and secured. If there's a strike, they call in the police and things like this. And the strikers are dealt with very, very harshly. It's only when apartheid ceases to be profitable that they start to slowly turn away from it and cultivate a new elite. In doing so, of course, right, they create a new oligarchy more directly. With the Afrikaner question, it's interesting just to sort of interpose them between these two extremes, this old Anglophone white mining oligarchy and the new ANC oligarchy, if you like. In between, you have the Afrikaners that emerge, but the Afrikaner oligarchy is very much pushed forward by the Afrikaner political elite in the National Party, which basically dominates or is the preponderant power in most South African governments from 1924 onward. In 1948, they become basically the masters of the political arena, and they very deliberately cultivate an ethnic group of Afrikaner capitalists, a select number of individuals. The leading example of this is the Rupert family, okay, Anton and Johan Rupert. And then that Afrikaner elite, interestingly, merged and melded into the old white English-speaking elite. They become, by the 1980s certainly, more or less indistinguishable. What happens after 1990, 94 is you begin to see the emergence of very, very slowly at first and then very, very rapidly. By about 1996, it's already well locked in as a policy of a black ANC oligarchy, which does not use wealth to defend wealth. It uses politics to accumulate wealth. And in exchange for not pressurizing white capital inordinately, in exchange for passing radical legislation but never actually executing or carrying out that legislation, they are given favors. They are given directorships in white companies. They are given corporate salaries. They are given perks and privileges, and most lucratively, they're given shares in these companies, which allows them to found their own companies, or they're given the financing they need to buy shares in white companies. So what's happened today, and I still think this is the case, you have a white oligarchic group, which is more or less has become cohesive and merged together, and a black oligarchic elite, which is sort of hovering alongside in a sort of uneasy relationship with the white oligarchy. Occasionally they make noises that if you don't play ball, we're going to nationalize land or we're going to institute national health. But thus far, at least, it seems they haven't done it, because it's more, I think, a tactic to extract rents from the white oligarchy. It's transferring rents from a white oligarchy to a black one.
For those of you who might not know this, can you briefly explain the ethnicity of the Afrikaners? Because now we have the Anglo-American, which obviously is, white. You have the black ANC, which is black. So Afrikaners, they might think, it's Afrikaners. So what is the ethnicity of Afrikaners?
Yeah, I mean, Afrikaners are basically descendants of Dutch-speaking settlers that came to South Africa in the 17th century, most of which are of Dutch origin. But if you trace their genealogies, there's a large chunk that is French Huguenot, so French Protestants, which came to South Africa to escape religious persecution, 17th century France, especially under Louis XIV. You also have a large German element, but, like, say, white people in the United States, they merge into each other. They all start speaking the same language. They all are vast majority Christian. They subscribe to roughly sort of similar cultural values. There is an elite in the Afrikaner class in the Western Cape that is largely slave owning. And you could see that as a kind of regional or more sort of local oligarchic class, which uses their influence to guarantee slave property under the Dutch East India Company state. When the British come in, there are a few that sort of do business with the British, that collaborate, if you want to use that sort of language or terminology. But many, I would say almost a majority or a large group, refuse, and they break off and settle the South African interior. So some people have called this settler colonialism.
Yeah,
it's tricky because, of course, this is a very small group of people. It's not like Australia or the United States.
So is it possible? Oh, sorry to cut you. You might continue.
It's okay, but just very quickly, it's a very tiny minority that has a very hostile and ambiguous relationship with British elites and British groups, I would say, until the second half of the 20th century. Then they start to pretty much merge together. Yeah.
So is it possible to then say that the British, if we look at the British, because in my last book, I was looking at the history of colonialism and the legacy of manipulating the different ethnicities, and also one is the history of violence, which the post-colonial states have inherited. Because sometimes, so from what you've said, when I've read it in the article as well, the British colonial system is one that was very extractive. It wasn't one that was coming to integrate, no national integration. That was not the purpose of that. Whatever integration could have been something that in the later stage, the damage had already been done. So could we say that the colonial, to what extent did that British colonial system contribute to what we see, this kind of like voyeuristic, this kind of like structural inequality and apartheid system and all this kind of, to what extent did it contribute to it?
Well, there's a whole school of thought, say in South African history, South African social theory, of a Marxian, I would say more Marxian than hardcore Marxist, thinking, which says, apartheid emerged in the mines. Apartheid emerged because of British capital and what it did to the South African economy. So yes, I think British capital is very, very important in architecting a system of sort of structural violence, or that's the term we like to use today. Structural inequality, structural violence is very much British colonial in origin. And a lot of these mining companies, some of which still exist in South Africa today, they've merged, there are new conglomerates that form. But if you trace the component parts, or if you trace the company itself, are colonial companies. And I think this is a big problem. If a colonial company comes in from London with London financing, right, sets up itself in Johannesburg, its primary objective is to extract minerals and repatriate those minerals to London, or repatriate profits to London, right? So I think that the nationalization of the South African mines, I know it never happened. It never happened. It's unlike, say, in Nigeria, you have a national petroleum company, but that helps ordinary Nigerians.
Nah.
It doesn't, of course, right? So you see, there is that ambiguity. Had the mines been nationalized, would ordinary Black South Africans have benefited? No. But you could maybe say, arguably, that white South Africans would have lost. They would have lost big time. And in order to prevent that, they invest in a Black capitalist class, which is not quite a capitalist class. It's a sort of political oligarchic class, I would say.
I'm looking at that because when we look at the state of Africa now, so if I look at South Africa and even beyond South Africa. But I'm going to look at Africa because South Africa seems to be one where there is what I call a misplaced anger from majority black people that are like maybe lack opportunities, social opportunities, and misplaced anger towards, unfortunately, other black people, maybe from neighboring countries like Zimbabwe, like that are coming there, rather than focus on. So it would appear to me that they don't understand these dynamics, because you did say something you said when you were talking, which we'll come to in a minute, when we were talking about the coalitions, and then you were talking. I'll read what you said. You did say coalitions are unlikely to solve South Africa's underlying problem. Only direct negotiation between South Africa's economic and political stakeholders over fundamental issues. So how much lacking is this knowledge among the populace, black populace in South Africa, to not know these underlying dynamics with the real problems?
Surely, I mean, politics is all about distraction and division. I mean, politicians are professional distractors and dividers in any country, my country and European countries. That's what politicians are, I'm afraid. And it takes a sort of anti-immigrant rhetoric in my country too, right? In Britain, certainly, you see this now with anti-asylum seeking legislation. The idea that there is something precious about the national territory, and if it is not carefully guarded, then it will be overrun by outsiders. I think, for my money, and this is a universal sort of global north, and also in some sense more developed economy reaction. It's a tactic to distract the population from the real issue, which is, I think, in my view at least, the refusal of national elites, national oligarchic or interest groups that refuse to distribute wealth more equitably. In South Africa, of course, there is a problem in that this economy isn't as developed as the global north, and thus the anti-immigrant actions have taken on, I think, a more rooted element, to the extent that you have regular pogroms, you can call them pogroms, against immigrants, in which the state authorities don't really intervene, not because they can't, but because they really don't want to, I would say. Again, I don't have evidence to prove it, but it seems to me they're remarkably reluctant, in South Africa especially, to prevent anti-immigrant riots. Whereas, say, in Britain, under the Starmer government, you had people were arrested, imprisoned for their vigilante actions and things like this. In a constitutional democracy, you have to have certain guarantees, otherwise you cease to be one. That's the idea. But yes, I do think that it is a distraction, because, again, particularly in South Africa is a nation of migrant laborers. The mining economy, if you go back to the 1870s, really, comes from outside, or a large part of it, a substantial part of it, comes from outside what becomes South Africa in 1910. And these immigrants, there is a lot of good sociological research, assimilate very quickly into the majority society. I don't think they want to change it. They want to join it. But the fear is, among ordinary South Africans, if they join it, a very bad unemployment problem, which hovers around 42%, which is unbelievable. It's terrifyingly high, will become even worse. See, again, more modern industrial global north democracies have unemployment figures in the mid-single digits. They don't have 40% unemployment.
I'm quite interested in the which speaks to more to the more obscure neocolonialism, neocolonial politics. When you were talking about many of the companies that operate here, like from London, from European cities, come to South Africa, get this, and so. But I'm more talking about the complicity or the dynamics of global capitalism. How? So we could also put in that mix. We could put what's going on in DRC, for instance. I was recently in a meeting where the foreign I was invited just this Monday. The foreign minister of DRC was come to talk about what's going on with the M23 and stuff like that. And I did ask a question looking at how the question of the global actors. So if we're looking at how you look at these elites in these places, you were talking about South Africa specifically, the Black ANC, which we will come to more specifically, the Black ANC and all of that. But I want you to first talk about the wider global side, the complicity of these elites, how they mesh into the global capitalism, and how they're able to keep that oil wheel of oppression, and it looks like the 1% of those that are rich, and then keep the poor. At the global level, we'll still come back to the specific politics in South Africa. If you could just speak to that.
Well, I mean, globally, certainly, South Africa in general has always been viewed as a center of resource extraction. I mean, if you go all the way back to the colonial days, that was a primary motivating factor, particularly, I would say, in British Africa, in southern British Africa, and also in Central Africa, certainly. The Belgian Congo was premised on resource extraction. But interestingly enough, there is this dynamic between, shall we say it, rogue oligarchs or rogue individuals, a Leopold II, a Cecil Rhodes, right, a Tiny Rowland, okay? These sort of maverick rogue oligarchs, perhaps the Guptas are a more contemporary example in South Africa. They don't necessarily have to be white, and there are many, many shady Chinese businessmen who are doing all kinds of shenanigans in the Congo today. There is that dynamic between these tiny select individuals and a more institutionalized form of oligarchic capital, which is more collective, it's more centered on boardrooms, it's tiny groups of people ruling by committee, rather than these maverick individuals who create all kinds of chaos. That's not to say that one is better than the other, but perhaps in a cold calculation, a sort of corporate committee, if there is the political will to do so, certainly, it's a little more, it's slightly easier to regulate. It's slightly easier to put conditions than a person who has multiple passports and has multiple offshore accounts, things like this, which are very, very hard to trace. I mean, again, global capital in general has found Africa very attractive because the elites in question, I think, are overpowered relative to civil society. And again, it can be a single white oligarch like a Tiny Rowland, or it can be a committee as well. They tend to gravitate towards dictatorial regimes because they're easier to do business with, right? I mean, this is why China, right, finds Putin's Russia very attractive. It's it's more or less sort of an authoritarian system ruled by a tiny group of Russian oligarchs that are relatively easy to do business with. And corporate oligarchies in the West are also very amenable to that sort of arrangement. But those corporations which have charters, which have more regular institutionalized features, tend to be easier to regulate. The problem, of course, is that Western politicians don't want to regulate them because they're being subsidized by them. I mean, the political campaigns are largely paid for by very, very powerful companies, company empires, right? Company empire as a phenomenon, which you could argue began as far back as the 16th century, is still with us today. Capitalism is a very resilient and very powerful system, and there's a lot, there's just as much continuity in it as there is change.
I will come to perhaps there seems to be some strong challenge and a more like a diffusion of, but we'll come to that in a minute. But what I want to talk about now is, in my recent research, what I'm looking at is the utility of liberal democracy. And I'm looking at how that also is leading to the militarization of stuff in Africa, looking at how leaders are elected, how is disincentivizing actual democracy to grow, where accountability is being demanded from the people, as long as there's some election. So that ties into what you're saying about the Black ANC, which I wanted to speak on, whereby they are giving power, political power, right to vote. And, we will come on the ANC getting power from 94. it wasn't, from what you say, it didn't affect, they didn't canvas or gain economically. They didn't challenge that economic disparity. It was more, okay, a political style. How do you see this? How are you able to differentiate between economic power and political power? And what are the benefits or demerits of all this in terms of like the dynamics?
Well, I mean, certainly there are some people who say that, people who I don't agree with, who say that, oh, things in South Africa now are worse than they were under apartheid. That's patently false. I mean, there are political rights, there is freedom of speech, there is a civil society, a very vibrant and critical civil society. And I can say with all sincerity, I would rather watch South African news than American news any day. I mean, it's more interesting. It's more insightful, and I think it's more challenging to the population. It holds up a mirror to the population and say, this is what we are. Let's try and do better. And many civil society organizations have that philosophy. Whereas, in Western democracies, media has become an echo chamber for the left or the right or whichever sort of political dispensation you have. So you can't gainsay the benefits of that. And the state in South Africa is more accountable than it used to be, certainly. But it's still premised itself on a notion of exclusive economic growth, or exclusive, more accurately, because the South African economy isn't growing. It's premised on exclusive economic affluence, not inclusive economic affluence. And that exclusivity is very much rooted in a past, in a colonial past and an apartheid past, where oligarchy has become, I think, too powerful relative to the rest of society in economic terms. One of the things I think that makes the West, slightly different is that we have many different oligarchs in many regions of many different countries who have different interests, who pull against and push for certain policies. And maybe this is just my American bias, but the United States is a fairly centralized country. You have the Silicon Valley oligarchy, you have the oil oligarchy, you have the tech oligarchy, and they're all sort of jostling for advantage, right? And that allows for a turnover of interests, a turnover of systems. What happened in South Africa, interestingly, and again, one can debate this endlessly, is that under Jacob Zuma, it looked like a new oligarchy was about to latch on. The Gupta family and their associated clients. But they were expelled from the country by the established oligarchic elite. Right? I'm not one of these people who subscribes to this sort of, Zuma represents capture and Ramaphosa represents at least an effort at renewal. It's one oligarchic interest group asserting a dominance and expelling another from a country, right? And I think the problem, of course, with the Zuma backers was that they were very shallow. They weren't very rooted in the country, like the Afrikaner elite, like the Anglo-American types, or old white Anglo-speaking capital, to put it more accurately. They were more embedded in the system, and they could resist the attempt by the Guptas to graft themselves on the national economy. I mean, in West Africa, too, you have these sort of shady Lebanese businessmen. I would be shocked if a Lebanese business conglomerate ever becomes more powerful than a sort of Nigerian oil company, because it's much more embedded in the society. So that might be.
But speaking of it, are we seeing a crack, or this question is on two layers. So we see with ANC, we see, because is it that fusion of corruption? Is it where can we see EDF and others as like? Is it a question of trying to get into that elite situation, trying to get into that corporate level, where we see the disintegration of ANC, see EDF, see Julius Malema, and then again, that's one level. The second level is: are we beginning to see a crack in all of these liberation parties? We could look at Mozambique, we could look at Botswana, we could look at Zimbabwe. Are we beginning to see some sort of shifts?
Yes, yes, I would say certainly that's very much in the cards. And Botswana, which was, shall we say it, the most liberal single party state, maybe South Africa is second to that. It's also quite a liberal single party dominant state. The Botswana group is out, right? And the ANC is exiting the political scene. However, the caution I would put with South Africa is that the fragments that are emerging from the ANC, Zuma's Umkhonto we Sizwe party, the EFF prior to that in 2013, these are, some would call them the ANC in drag, you know. I'm not sure about that, but they're still the same people. And how different these groups of people are, or how much better they are for the society, is really an open question. Perhaps, and again, you know, opposition parties in Mozambique, Renamo, that doesn't have a very pretty history. It's quite an ugly organization.
Yeah.
So again, I would be a bit cautious about the standard political lineup. And are these political actors going to change things when they displace the single party state, which it looks like it's going to happen, or it's happening in a kind of slow motion. My advice would be, if anybody's listening, that civil society has to pressurize whoever's in power to deliver. The problem is that most of civil society, or society in general, is so poor that it's so caught up in a daily struggle just to survive, really. I mean, if you go to a South African township, if you Langa or Deep Sloot in Langa around Cape Town, or Deep Sloot in the Rand or around the Rand, these people are just happy to get social grants. You know, they get another 10 Rand every election cycle, and that they do protest, and they do protest very violently. But I'm afraid a lot of that protest is just extreme frustration that occasionally pops. Sometimes it manifests itself in South Africa in the form of a farm murder. A white farmer gets murdered. Very rarely, contrary to all kinds of rhetoric that's floating around nowadays. But yes, it happens every now and again. It happens. So it's a sort of anger which manifests itself in a lashing out. And of course, it's perfectly understandable why that happens. But I think in order to construct a more progressive civil society, it's going to take a lot of work. And yes, this political tactic of using anti-immigration rhetoric, fortunately, it has been more effective than I would have hoped, at least. In other Southern African countries, of course, if you go to Zimbabwe, the ruling party is so merged, it's so fused with the military, that it would be very difficult. And of course, in Zimbabwe, what they do is they push people out. They say, well, you don't like it here, go to South Africa.
South Africa.
Frelimo does the same thing in Mozambique. There is I don't want to say it's a policy, but there's an understanding that in order to relieve social tensions, we push out people we can't accommodate, which is the vast majority of our population. And we have them go elsewhere for a time or for a period. Then they might come back, then they might return, or they might migrate permanently. It just depends on the situation. So I think, yes, single party rule is on its way out, but there's still a troubling tendency that opposition groups that dominate the political challenge to these ruling parties emerge from those very ruling parties themselves. This is what happened.
It's just a cycle. It looks like it's a cycle. But another thing that is also taking shape that we can see clearly is the geopolitics.
Yeah.
So we're seeing not just the superpowers. So you mentioned China in DRC. So we're seeing China, we're seeing Russia, we're also seeing the middle powers. We're seeing Turkey, we're seeing UAE, we're seeing all of these global competition. We're also seeing that also in the composition of power blocks. So we see expansion in BRICS. We see expansion in NATO and all of this stuff. So we saw this just now, and then we see Trump. Let's throw Trump into it with the recent stuff with the land policy and the recent threats. What do you make of the influence of Is this just to configure the elites? Is this what do you make of all of this geopolitics?
Well, certainly, the neo-isolationism in the United States. Again, I'm not fully in agreement with that isolationist label that Trump usually gets. It's a sort of reprioritization of American power, or a redirection of American power against the Chinese, right? However, I would say that Africa has always been a minority concern for the American policymaking elite, or governing elite, or political class. So how much the United States, well, under the current administration, I would say it's very minimal, or non-existent, the concern. They want to actually invest in Africa. I think that's become a problem, but it's always been a minimal concern. What I think is of greater concern is that the U.S. currently wants to disengage from Europe, and that creates more of an opening for a rise in Russian power, some people say. But again, Russia has been so drained by the Ukraine war that I'm not sure it's as much of a threat as people make it out to be. So there is a reconfiguration of power. There are opportunities, certainly for China on the African continent now, right? And maybe, again, it entirely depends on who is in charge, or what the administration wants to do in Washington. Sometimes there is a proclivity among the current administration policymakers to, I don't want to say court Russia, but turn Russia against the Chinese, basically. I think that's what they want to do. That's what they certainly wanted to do the first time around this crowd was in charge. But now it's become more complicated. So the Russians are very embittered by their experience. They're still very close to the Chinese. So there has been a sort of Eurasian bloc that's developed, which is making forays, or the Eurasian powers, China and Russia, are making forays into Africa and complicating the picture. That, of course, generates counter maneuvers, not through direct European intervention, but by hiring out other countries that are pro-Western, like Rwanda, of course. Then that blows up in your face, because the Rwandans think they can take aid from the French or the EU more generally to fight Islamic terror in Cabo Delgado, and then they use that same aid, that same weaponry, those same military credits or whatever, to fight a war in Eastern Congo. So it's very hard to control aid once it's released. And I think the Chinese also have this problem. I mean, you maybe make a deal with one militia, and you say, well, guard our mines and our artisanal mining sites here. And they say, yes, just give us the money. And then they buy weapons, and then they sell them to somebody else who attacks that mine. And so it's a very chaotic dynamic that I think African agency, this is something that I think Femi Taiwo, against decolonization, or against decolonization more generally, taking African agency seriously. We really need to do that. And I think African agents on the ground, not necessarily that African agency is not necessarily a good thing, but it is a factor that I think is underplayed in this larger scale analysis. Once you give somebody weaponry, once you give them money, nobody can tell you what's going to happen with that money and that weaponry next.
Mesrob, you just hit the nail on my current research on how the several actors that are militarizing Africa, the geopolitics, and the Minister of Foreign Affairs for their school did mention this, like in terms of how Paul Kagame has been giving weapons to fight in the Cabo Delgado and all of this, and then you don't have a count of how many weapons, how those weapons have been used in DRC. That was also mentioned, and then the African agency as well in terms of all of this. But if we come to the conclusion now, let's come to wrap up and look at one. Talking about African agency, in my book, I was looking at the future. I was looking at the youth. Africa has a teeming youth population that are becoming very politically active.
Yeah,
challenging these existing structures. But then again, how organized they are, how far they can, course, a useful changes is be questionable. I do see a potential there. So I wanted you to look at all of that picture and give us a picture of how do you see this playing out? What do you see the states? South Africa, of course, that's our focus. Then the more generally in Africa as well, because elite politics, unfortunately, cuts across Africa. South Africa is the case of all African states, post-colonial states. So how do you see all of these playing out in the short, medium, and long term?
Yes, I mean, again, the late George Aite had this very strong proponent of this argument that the young in Africa will overtake the decrepit and the old, and I think he called it the cheetah generation, if I'm not mistaken, or some sort of slogan he gave to it. Will overtake the old and the decrepit and take Africa forward. That is very much an aspiration for me as well, but it's still, I don't want to say, in certain countries, I would say that remains very aspirational as a goal. Because if you look at and I know South Africa best, if you look at what's happening to the young Black poor in South Africa, a lot of these people are going into criminality, not because they are African, but because there are very few alternatives available to this demographic group, particularly young Black men are the primary victims of violent crime. Why is that? I mean, it seems to me there is a danger that the youth are being, I don't want to say led astray, but are going in directions which are not necessarily sort of able to challenge inequality. What it's doing, the gangs in South Africa, people who join radical Islamist groups in Nigeria, right? What it's doing is it's adding another group of extractive, predatory actors or agents onto a local space. And I think that is something that really needs to be challenged and avoided, not because, we have to sort of expect the youth to do better. You can't expect them to do better if they're not given sufficient opportunity and alternative to these very, if I can use this sort of overused term, toxic kind of youth mobilization and toxic kind of youth organization, which leads in all kinds of mean and nasty and ugly directions. Again, for my money, a drug gang in the Western Cape is not that different from an Islamist insurgent group in northern Nigeria or northwestern Nigeria, northeastern Nigeria. It seems to me, or a group of raiders in Nigeria who kill and plunder cattle and things like this, or in the Rift Valley in Kenya, you have many, many such raiding bandit groups, all of whom are made up of young men. And I think that just because they're young doesn't mean they're going to challenge the old. If they are not given sufficient opportunity by the people in charge, if these people don't create the conditions in which this group can actually contribute productively, they're going to contribute destructively. And I think that is a very large danger. One of the reasons, one among many, that Congo has so many militia groups is because these young men don't have much else. I mean, criminality is their only way forward. We have some of this in some cities in the inner United States. Why do Black youth join drug gangs and die early deaths? Well, because that's pretty much the only opportunity they have.
I agree with you, Mesrob. I agree with you. Unfortunately, this is a very interesting conversation. I think we definitely need to have a part 2 of this, but I really did enjoy this conversation, and thank you for a very, very rich insight into this.
Thank you very much, Michael. I look forward to speaking with you again.
We do appreciate it. Thank you very much, and it's very early there. Sorry once again.
No problem.
All right, take care. Have a great day.
You as well. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you once again for tuning in to this week's episode. As usual, join me to thank our guest, Dr. Mesrob Vartavarian, for his objective and very useful comments on elite politics and oligarchic power in South Africa. For now, stay blessed, and I'll see you next week.